Imagine a candle flickering in a marble corridor, its flame trembling under the breath of something unspoken. It is midnight in Rome. Behind thick velvet curtains and centuries-old stone, a child weeps. Not in a home, not in the streets, but behind the sacred walls of the Holy See. Her tiny sobs are muffled by embroidered robes, concealed beneath layers of incense, prayer, and silence. Outside, a choir rehearses solemn hymns. Inside, sin is whispered like a blessing. This is not a story of faith. It is a story of power, of secrets too human to be holy, and of women erased before their names could be written. We often imagine the Vatican as a beacon of chastity and sanctity, a citadel of celibacy, its priests and popes devoted not to flesh but to God. But beneath the towering arches and golden ceilings, another story has always existed. One not carved in marble or sung in masses. It begins in locked chambers. It ends in forgotten graves. The contradiction is ancient, a church that forbade touch, yet indulged it behind its most sacred curtains. A religion that celebrated the Virgin Mary, yet vilified women who dared to love, or be loved, by those who wore the robes of Christ's emissaries. These weren't mere affairs. They were quiet arrangements, tragic romances, coercive unions. And the women, their names were often never recorded. Their stories? Silenced before they ever left the walls. But history has a strange way of keeping its ghosts. And if you listen long enough, you can hear them whisper. The women we speak of tonight were not queens, not saints, not celebrated heroines. They were concubines to the popes, the most powerful men in Christendom, who ruled not just over faith, but over kings, kingdoms, and emperors. And yet when darkness fell, these same men crept into chambers where they weren't supposed to be. Not with swords, but with desire. Some called it sin. Others called it survival. This is not merely about scandal. It's about the tension between public virtue and private vice, between what we proclaim and what we practice. It's about what institutions choose to remember and what they erase. And it's about the women who lived in the shadows of white marble palaces, whose only crime was being loved or used by men who pretended not to love at all. Tonight, we follow their footprints through centuries of silence. We walk through locked doors. We sit in candlelit confessionals. We listen, because not all sins are committed in the dark. Some are protected by robes and gold. It was not always forbidden. In the earliest centuries of the Christian Church, priests married. Bishops fathered children. Even early popes, those sainted in our stained glass windows, were family men, their names stitched into Roman census rolls beside wives and sons. Celibacy, as a sacred obligation, was not a divine commandment. It was a human invention. And like most inventions born of control, it came wrapped in the language of purity, but reeked of politics. By the 4th century, whispers began. Sexual abstinence, it was said, made one holier, more devoted to God, less stained by the distractions of the flesh. But it wasn't until the 12th century, at the First and Second Lateran Councils, that the Church officially enforced celibacy as law. Not for reasons of morality, but for reasons of money. A priest with no wife would have no heirs. No heirs meant no inheritance. No inheritance meant the Church kept the land, the wealth, the legacy. What began as spiritual discipline became a centuries-long performance, an institution dressed in robes of chastity, while beneath the surface, desire burned hotter than incense. Popes preached purity by day, and tasted sin by night. Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, was perhaps the most flagrant. A man whose papacy dripped in lust, gold, and blood. He didn't just have lovers. He had a mistress he paraded openly, Vanazza de Catanae. Their children, Lucrezia and Cesare, were not just acknowledged, but strategically placed into powerful political roles. Lucrezia, betrothed and re-betrothed as a pawn of Vatican diplomacy. Cesare, transformed from cardinal to warlord. Their family dinners were whispered about even in Rome, where scandal was a common guest. Pope Julius II, dubbed the warrior pope, fared no better. His enemies in the Curia accused him of sodomy, of fathering a daughter out of wedlock, of keeping male lovers in secret. His reign was not one of holiness, but of conquest, of both cities and bodies. And then came Pope Innocent VIII. The irony in his name was almost cruel. He openly acknowledged at least 16 illegitimate children. During his reign, Vatican resources were funneled to secure positions for them: marriages, titles, land. The papal court turned from spiritual sanctuary into a dynastic court of nepotism. These weren't isolated men. They were the heads of a global church, and their sins were not secrets, they were customs, protected by silence, buried beneath liturgy, camouflaged in robes. The women in these stories, they were rarely more than footnotes. Most were young, some barely into womanhood. They were chosen for their beauty, their obedience, or their lineage. A nobleman seeking favor might offer his daughter. A poor family might accept Vatican gold. A cardinal might pluck a servant from a convent garden. In time, these women became prisoners of paradox, kept in hidden villas or ecclesiastical apartments, adorned in silks yet denied names in the history books. Some were gifted titles: Marquesa, Contessa, mere decorations to justify their presence. Others were shut away once they became inconvenient, once their beauty faded, once they spoke. And what of their children? Some were passed off as nephews. Others vanished. The hypocrisy didn't end in bedrooms. It seeped into sermons, confessions, and laws. The same church that demanded purity from its flock, that punished women for adultery, that condemned sex outside marriage, harbored within its own walls a theater of quiet indulgence. Even as nuns were flogged for impure thoughts, popes sat with mistresses beneath tapestries of Christ. Even as women were burned for witchcraft, concubines were bearing papal children in hidden villas. The dichotomy is not just staggering, it is foundational. Because what is more powerful than sin cloaked in holiness? What is more dangerous than a man who answers only to God and claims God speaks through him? Some historians argue that these indulgences were simply the way of the time, that it was expected, even understood, that celibacy was a rule for the poor, not the powerful. But the danger of such thinking is this: when the rules are not real for those who write them, they become tools of control, not of virtue. They become masks. And behind those masks, generations of women lived and died without voice, without recognition, and without justice. In archives and footnotes, we find the faintest traces. A silk ledger noting a monthly stipend to a Roman lady. A cardinal's diary referring to the girl in the red chapel. A papal decree appointing a 10-year-old child, a bastard son, as the new bishop of a small diocese. And we begin to understand. Celibacy was never about holiness. It was about theater. And beneath the stage, beneath the incense, the choirs, the Latin hymns, lay broken vows, hidden lovers, and a church too sacred to be questioned. But history remembers. And now, so do we. The lives they lived, from courtesans to prisoners. What did it mean to be the secret consort of the most powerful man in the Christian world? To be touched by the hand that offered blessings, but never acknowledgement. To share a bed with a man who ruled over nations, yet denied your existence and daylight. The lives of papal mistresses cannot be neatly summarized. They stretch across centuries and continents, from Renaissance Rome to Baroque Florence, from candlelit gardens to sealed convents. Their stories are scattered, part myth, part whisper, part suppressed record. But one thing remains painfully consistent. They lived at the mercy of men who preached mercy but practiced silence. Many of these women came from noble blood. To a wealthy Roman family, having a daughter become a pope's companion meant influence, access, security. It was a strange form of arranged ambition, gilded in pearls but rotting at its core. Others were born in poverty. Orphans, servants, girls plucked from convents. Their beauty caught a priest's eye, and their fate was sealed before they even knew what it meant. And some were already nuns. There's the documented case of a young Florentine novice transferred to a Vatican-adjacent convent. There, under the guise of spiritual protection, she became the personal companion to a high-ranking cardinal. Her letters, found centuries later in a forgotten trunk, reveal a life lived in velvet cages. "I was taught to fear men," she wrote, "but not those who came to me with holy rings and whispered prayers." Another tale comes from the reign of Pope Paul III. Historians suspect that he kept a mistress outside the city walls in a countryside villa surrounded by olive groves. She never attended court. She never walked through the Vatican gardens. Yet every week, a carriage left the apostolic palace, and returned before dawn. Inside, no records, no names, only silence. There's evidence of a Venetian noblewoman, just 16, who was offered to a bishop in hopes that her family might secure a political alliance. She was brought to Rome and vanished from public view. Years later, a letter from her mother surfaced, addressed not to the Pope, but to his chamberlain. She writes of sleepless nights and marble floors, the mother pleads. Does the Holy Father not remember that she too has a soul? Some concubines were kept in splendor. They wore silk gowns, dined on pheasant, and lived in apartments with frescoed ceilings and silver basins. Yet what they gained in luxury, they lost in freedom. They could not speak openly. They could not marry. They could not leave. Others fared worse. When a mistress became inconvenient, too emotional, too outspoken, too old, she might be sent away. To a convent, to a cousin's estate, or simply paid off and erased. Records from the 17th century describe a facility near Rome. A former nunnery turned into a kind of holding pen for women of scandal. Church officials called it a place of spiritual retreat. But the reports tell a darker story. Iron gates, silent corridors, no mirrors. Women who had once held the most intimate secrets of popes now slept on straw and prayed for redemption they were never promised. The mental toll of this invisibility is hard to fathom. To live in luxury but without identity. To carry a child who will never be named. To hear Mass preached about sin, while knowing your womb is called shame by the very man who confesses before the altar. Some women bore it with resignation. Others fought. One account buried in Vatican trial archives speaks of a concubine who confronted her cardinal lover in front of his peers. "You dare call me harlot," she is quoted as saying, "but it was your hands that bruised my virtue, not mine." She was sent away, her name redacted, her fate unknown. And then there were the children. Some of these women bore papal offspring, sons and daughters who would never know legitimacy. They were baptized in secrecy, raised as nephews, or hidden in monasteries. A few, like Cesare Borgia, rose to prominence under veils of half-truths. Most disappeared into silence. Imagine carrying a child whose father blesses thousands, but will not bless his own. Inquisitorial records tell of another woman, Luciana. A laundress turned mistress to a Vatican treasurer. When her pregnancy began to show, she was accused of heresy, not for the affair, but for speaking about it. She was put on trial not for the sin, but for the words. It was safer to bear the child of a pope than to speak of it. We must ask, what makes a life meaningful? Is it the monuments, the titles, the legacy? Or is it the secret resilience of a woman denied all of those things, yet still breathing, feeling, remembering? The papal concubines were not saints, nor were they monsters. They were women trapped in a machine that disguised abuse as holiness and silence as virtue. They were courtesans wrapped in lace, prisoners with perfumes, ghosts wearing the scent of sanctity. Today, their names are largely lost, their portraits misattributed, their voices scattered across censored letters and dismissed diaries. But behind the veil of the Vatican, behind the Latin chants and golden chalices, they lived, they wept, they loved. And they paid the price for a church that demanded silence from those it used. Holy bloodlines, children of the unseen popes. What happens when power breaks its own commandments and leaves behind blood? The story of the papal concubines does not end with secrecy and shadows. It continues through flesh, through bloodlines, through the children fathered in locked chambers, denied in public, but known all too well behind gilded Vatican doors. These were not mythical tales. They were flesh and bone, names etched into private records, sealed letters, and whispered rumors in noble halls. And while the church preached celibacy, some of its most powerful leaders created dynasties, illegitimate yet impossible to ignore. Take Giovanni Borgia. Born in the swirling scandals of the late 15th century, he was called Infans Romanus, the Roman child. His parentage remains one of the Vatican's most perplexing mysteries. Some sources claim he was the son of Pope Alexander VI. Others whisper he was the product of an incestuous union between Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia, making him the Pope's grandson, or his son, or both. He was granted titles, land, and a court, yet no one ever dared confirm who his true parents were. A papal bull was issued naming him a nephew. Another document called him a servant of the church. His life was constructed like a puzzle, each piece carefully arranged to obscure the truth. What kind of childhood is that? To grow up surrounded by privilege, while knowing your very existence is an embarrassment. To sit beneath the dome of St. Peter's Basilica, and know you are the mistake that cannot be spoken. Giovanna's story is not unique. Pope Innocent VIII had at least 16 children. They were not hidden in alleys, they were granted bishoprics, arranged noble marriages, appointed to oversee dioceses. One daughter, Teodorina, married into a powerful Roman family. One son, Francescetto Saibo, was given control over military and financial posts in the Papal States. The church became an engine of nepotism, its corridors not just spiritual but hereditary. The word, nepotism itself, is derived from the Latin nepos, meaning nephew. But these nephews were often sons. By calling them nephews, the Vatican could maintain its illusion of chastity while building bloodlines in secret. And the women, the mothers of these children, still silent, still unnamed. Even those children acknowledged by their papal fathers were marked by contradiction. They carried noble titles, but not legitimacy. Their births were often recorded under aliases. Their baptisms attended by servants, not saints. They inherited power, but rarely peace. Some found themselves used as pawns. A daughter married to seal a treaty. A son made bishop at 14. Their identities were blurred, simultaneously holy and profane. They were living proof of hypocrisy, and the Vatican knew it. That's why so many were hidden. There are accounts of children raised inside monasteries under false names, given private tutors, kept away from Rome. A few were even sent abroad, to France, Spain, or Naples, where their lineage would raise fewer questions. But some left their mark. Cesare Borgia, the illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI, became a cardinal before the age of 20. Later, he abandoned the cassock for armor. With Vatican funds and political power, he led military campaigns across Italy. His cruelty and brilliance inspired Machiavelli's The Prince. He was not a spiritual leader, but a warlord born from a papal bed. In Caesare's rise, we see the full distortion of the church's duality. A man birthed by sin, raised in secrecy, unleashed with divine sanction. The church, officially, denounced such behavior. Unofficially, it built it. The psychological toll on these children is harder to measure. Many grew up knowing their mother's name, but not their father's. Or worse, knowing their father's title, but never his affection. Some bore the shame of being called bastards, even as they wielded more power than kings. Imagine being raised in palaces, with no portraits. Imagine hearing your father preach against lust while you carry the weight of his. These weren't just scandals. They were wounds. Wounds inherited like titles. We often think of the church as a body of doctrine, of laws and creeds. But institutions like families have secrets. And secrets passed down become patterns. And patterns ignored become tradition. The children of the unseen popes reveal a truth the Vatican never dared say aloud. That sin, when protected by sacred robes, does not disappear. It simply changes its name. In dusty archives we still find traces. A will written in secret, leaving property to a spiritual son. A letter from a noblewoman demanding her daughter be acknowledged. A portrait of a boy, his features unmistakably similar to a reigning pope, yet labeled only N. Their stories are not footnotes. They are threads woven through centuries of silence. These children were living contradictions, born of broken vows, raised in opulence, erased from scripture. But they were there. They breathed. They bore the burden of truth, for a church that could never admit it. The Vatican's silent erasure, how the church buried their names. History is not only shaped by what is remembered, it is also shaped, perhaps more deeply, by what is deliberately forgotten. By the time the Enlightenment rolled through Europe and revolution threatened altars and monarchs alike, the church had already mastered the art of selective memory. It had learned to sand away the inconvenient edges of truth, to whitewash shame into sanctity, to conceal its sins not by denying them, but by naming them something else. And nowhere is this more evident than in how it dealt with the women behind the popes. The mistresses, lovers, coerced companions, the ones who bore papal children, warm papal beds, and watched as their names were quietly blotted from every official parchment. Church records, particularly those from the 16th through 19th centuries, were not just spiritual ledgers. They were instruments of control, and control, in this case, meant revision. A woman known to be a pope's mistress might appear in early correspondence, perhaps noted as a benefactor or Roman lady of service, but in later summaries, her name would vanish. The ink would fade, the entries redacted, the titles reassigned, and the woman herself reduced to a euphemism, a spiritual companion, a household guest, or most often, nothing at all. Portraits were altered. In Vatican galleries and noble estates, paintings once displaying women beside their clerical lovers were quietly revised. In some, faces were painted over. In others, feminine figures were obscured behind drapes or statues. Entire canvases vanished into vaults. A few reappeared centuries later, damaged, incomplete, misattributed. One 17th century painting, originally titled The Cardinal and His Muse, resurfaced in a museum inventory under a new name. Died in inspiration. The woman's features had been scraped, her silhouette faint beneath layers of varnish. Only the cardinal remained pristine, his ring glinting in the candlelight. She had become a ghost in his story. A symbol, a caution, never a person. Even more insidious than visual erasure was linguistic burial. Take papal decrees. When a child of a pope was acknowledged, the language used was surgical in its distance. The nephew of our holiness, a young man under our spiritual patronage, a lady once known to our court. This was not just avoidance, it was obliteration. To strip someone of name, of title, of origin, is to erase their humanity. And then there were the convents. Hundreds of young women entered religious life during this time. Some, willingly, others, less so. Convents served a dual purpose: spiritual refuge and strategic silence. A mistress could be placed in a cloister for repentance. In reality, it was a quarantine, a way to remove her from public view while maintaining church decorum. Their names changed upon entry. Their letters were censored, their stories confined behind iron grills and stone walls. One such woman, whose family attempted legal action to retrieve her, was last recorded as Sister Maria of the Five Wounds. Her birth name had been Clara Farnese. Her child, fathered by a cardinal, was never baptized under the family name. Both mother and child were erased, not by death, but by design. Art, too, bore the weight of this forgetting. In Vatican frescoes, the feminine form, once symbolic of divine beauty, became abstract. Mary remained, of course, idealized in blue robes. But other women, lovers, queens, courtesans, they faded. One Vatican hall once displayed a tapestry showing a pope receiving the Council of Wisdom, depicted by a veiled woman. After political shifts and scandals, that same tapestry was replaced. The new version featured only male advisors. The woman of wisdom had been deemed too suggestive, too real, too close to the truth. In the 20th and 21st centuries, a new generation of scholars, many of them women, began digging. They found what the church had hidden: letters in monastery cellars, diaries mislabeled in aristocratic archives, ledgers from Vatican treasuries detailing payments to unnamed women in silk tarfo. Slowly, painfully, the veil began to lift. We began to learn names: Vanoza di Catanae, Giulia Farnese, Olympia Medalcini. Not just mistresses, not just fallen women, mothers, political pawns, survivors, human beings caught in a system that used piety to mask patriarchy. Their erasure was not accidental. It was systematic, because if the church admitted to their stories, fully, openly, it would also have to admit to what those stories exposed: that the very institution built on moral authority had allowed its leaders to break that morality, and then silence the witnesses. What does it mean to exist, and yet be scrubbed from history? To be touched by a hand that holds a cross, and then be denied by the same voice that preaches forgiveness? What does it mean to live your life in the shadows of golden domes? To bear the children of saints, and to be buried in unmarked graves? These women were never saints, but neither were they sinners. They were simply real. And in a world ruled by myth, real women are the most dangerous threat of all. Modern mirrors, when institutions choose silence over truth. History, we are told, belongs to the past. But the stories we choose to tell, and the ones we suppress, have a peculiar way of echoing forward. They do not stay sealed in books or tombs. They appear again, wearing new robes. Sometimes not in cathedrals, but in courtrooms. Not under frescoed ceilings, but beneath fluorescent lights. The Church's centuries-long pattern of secrecy, moral contradiction, and institutional protection isn't an anomaly of a distant age. It is a mirror, reflecting something deeper and more persistent about the human tendency to preserve power at the cost of truth. In 2022, headlines around the world began reporting something that had long existed beneath the surface. That priests, in countries as wide-ranging as the United States, Ireland, and Brazil, had been sexually abusing children for decades. And more devastatingly, that the Church had known, had moved abusers between parishes, had silenced victims through payoffs and confidentiality agreements, had preached repentance while hiding rot behind velvet curtains. It wasn't just the abuse. It was the structure built to protect those who committed it. The same Church that once buried its papal concubines in euphemism and erasure was now revealed to have done the same with abusers, replacing scandal with silence, victim with theology. And yet, this isn't just about the Catholic Church. This is about what happens when any institution, religious, political, or cultural, becomes more invested in its own survival than in justice. History repeats, not in identical costumes, but in patterns. A spiritual leader who calls for purity while abusing the vulnerable. A government that praises freedom while disappearing dissenters. A corporation that celebrates inclusion while exploiting its workers. A patriarch who calls himself protector while erasing the woman who bears his child. We've seen it in authoritarian regimes, in cults disguised as churches, in elite schools and gilded organizations. Silence becomes doctrine. Image becomes more important than integrity. And those who speak out, whether they are mistresses, children, or whistleblowers, are cast as traitors to something larger than themselves. This is the thread that links the forgotten concubines of the Renaissance to the victims of modern-day scandals. The belief that some truths are too dangerous to acknowledge. That power, once exposed, must either be redeemed or denied. But the question is no longer whether these truths exist. The question is, what do we do with them? Do we continue to bury names? Do we keep rebuilding the myth, brick by brick, generation after generation? Or do we allow the past, in all its contradiction and pain, to be seen clearly? It's easy to think of history as distant, but the women erased by the Vatican were not symbols. They were human. Just as the modern victims of institutional betrayal are not case numbers, they are daughters, sons, mothers, believers. Their pain is real. Their silence was taught, and their dignity, long overdue. Perhaps the most tragic echo is this, that even today, around the world, women still find themselves silenced by systems that preach protection, still threatened by the same architecture of shame, still made invisible by men who are too sacred to be questioned. And when they speak, the world still asks them to prove their worth, to justify their memory, to make their pain palatable. But history is shifting. Slowly, relentlessly, truth leaks through the cracks. In archives, in journalism, in art, in whispers that refuse to stay buried. Modern historians, many of them women, are no longer content to let the Church, or any power, decide who gets remembered. They are piecing together fragments, letters, ledgers, testimonies. They are returning names to the nameless, not to shame, but to restore, to say, you existed, you mattered, you were not a myth. The weight of forgotten names. The halls of the Vatican are quiet at night. Stone corridors echo with the soft shuffle of a janitor's broom. Candles flicker beneath ancient frescoes. Statues of saints and martyrs watch in solemn silence, eyes carved to see heaven, yet fixed on mortal stone. But somewhere in that silence, a voice remains. Not the voice of a pope, or a cardinal, or a scribe. Not the clang of bells, or the rustle of vestments, but something smaller, fainter, almost lost. The voice of a woman I was once the most desired woman in Rome. Now, I am not even a footnote. We do not know her name. She could have been Julia Farnese, the bride of Christ who slept in the Pope's bed, or Vannozza de Catanai, who bore Alexander VI 4 children and was buried as a benefactor, not a lover, or one of the hundreds whose names never reached a page. But her voice, pieced from fragments, from letters, from whispers, is the thread we carry into the end. She was not a saint, nor a villain. She was a woman with a heart and skin and fears, caught in a machine that dressed sin in silk and silence. As we leave the story behind, we must ask, what becomes of the forgotten? Do they vanish into the dust of closed archives? Do they fade like scratched-out names from convent ledgers? Do they forgive the world that consumed them and left no room for their story? Or do they linger, in portraits painted over, in children renamed, in church halls where incense once masked the smell of secrecy? History cannot be undone. We cannot bring justice to bones. But we can remember. And in remembering, we resist. We resist the erasure. We resist the false sanctity. We resist the rewriting that lets institutions sin and still be called sacred. The concubines of the popes bore more than children. They bore the cost of contradictions, of desire cloaked in denial, of love twisted into leverage, of a church that proclaimed holiness, while hiding its humanity in the arms of the women it swore never to need. So what do we do now, centuries later? We listen. We name what was unnamed. We see who was hidden. And we walk through history not as tourists of glory, but as mourners of truth. Because behind every robe was a man. Behind every man, a woman. And behind every silence, a story waiting to be told. They were there. Behind velvet curtains. Behind locked convent doors. Behind the holy men we built empires around. They watched. They waited. They wept. And now, they speak. Through us.